On the morning of November 17, 1928, Chicago awoke to a biting chill, typical of late autumn. Shortly after the first hours of the day, Al Capone sat in a private dining room at the Lexington Hotel, gazing at a meticulously set table that had not yet been touched. That space was not just an elegant room, it was a center of power. There, decisions were made without records, without official witnesses, but with consequences that spread throughout the country. The Lexington was not just a hotel, it was an invisible fortress. Every employee was on its payroll. Every corridor could become an escape route or a trap. Every visitor was observed even before crossing the main door. Capone was only 29 years old, but he was already a living myth. He controlled smuggling operations that yielded more than $100 million a year, an unimaginable amount for most legitimate businessmen of the time. He had survived the bloodiest year of Prohibition, crushed competitors, bought off cops, judges, and city council members, and consolidated an empire that had transformed Chicago into the epicenter of American organized crime. He was, at the same time, the most powerful and the most hunted man in the United States. Bombs had failed, shots had missed, assassination attempts had been thwarted. Capone had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that absolute power doesn't eliminate threats, it only changes their form. And that morning, the problem that troubled him couldn't be solved with violence. The name of that problem was Harlem. For months, white gangsters had been trying to encroach on the lucrative gambling operations controlled by black operators. The result was always the same: money burned, men killed, no real control gained. Each attack attracted more attention from the federal police. Each week of war diminished the profits that should have been growing. When his advisors presented an alternative, Capone initially reacted with scorn. Not because the idea was financially absurd, but because it broke a deep-seated dogma of the American underworld. You want me to negotiate with a black gangster? The question wasn't just racist, it was structural. In 1928, organized crime reflected the same brutal segregation of American society. White gangsters controlled the big gears. Black gangsters survived within the limits allowed or imposed by them. But that morning, that logic was about to be tested. The man Capone was waiting for was 23 years old, too young for that level of risk, too black to be there according to any unwritten rule. His name was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't an adventurer, he was an emissary. He spoke on behalf of Stephanie St. Clair, the strategist known in Harlem as Madame Queen, the woman who had transformed the numbers game into a sophisticated financial machine, resistant to violence and outside infiltration. She understood something many armed men didn't. Constant war destroys profit. The proposal Johnson carried to Chicago wasn't a plea for clemency. It wasn't submission. It wasn't betrayal. It was a cold, calculated, and dangerously audacious business proposition. Harlem wanted rules. It wanted clear boundaries. It wanted to stop the bleeding of money and blood. And it was willing to pay for it, but not to disappear. The mere fact that this meeting was happening was in itself an explosive secret. If it came to light, it would destroy carefully constructed narratives about power, race, and control. Therefore, everything that would be said there needed to remain buried. Capone knew this. While he waited, he didn't think about killing the visitor. He thought about numbers, about costs, about the future. He thought about the inevitable day when Prohibition would end, and who would be prepared when that happened. Without fully realizing it, Al Capone was about to discover that his greatest weapon had never been violence. It was the ability to recognize when cooperation yielded more than conquest by force, even if it violated all the social rules of segregated America. The door was still closed, but the world of organized crime was already beginning to change.
At 9:47 a.m., Bumpy Johnson walked through the revolving doors of the Lexington Hotel. The simple act of entering that building already represented a challenge to the unwritten rules of 1928 America. Bumpy was a black man walking alone through the headquarters of the most powerful white gangster in the country. In a city where many hotels didn't even allow black customers to enter through the front door, Johnson was advancing through a space where men died without leaving a trace. He didn't enter as a customer. He entered as a message. From the moment he stepped into the lobby, every movement was observed. Employees feigned normalcy, but they knew exactly who he was. Two large Italian men in dark suits discreetly positioned themselves beside him. They said nothing. They didn't need to. That wasn't an escort. It was a silent warning. Bumpy had already been searched twice. First, when he arrived at Union Station days before. Then again, as he crossed the hotel lobby. No weapons, no visible papers, just a simple suit, expensive enough to indicate status, but discreet enough not to provoke. He knew that any wrong move would be interpreted as a threat. He also knew that if he showed fear, he would lose respect before he even opened his mouth. The elevator ascended slowly. During those seconds, Johnson understood with absolute clarity the position he was in. If Al Capone decided to reject the offer, the promise of safe passage would not mean comfort, only immediate survival. But if Capone felt disrespected, not even that would be guaranteed. The fourth-floor hallway was too quiet. Closed doors, thick carpets muffling footsteps, the smell of cigars mixed with fresh coffee. Every detail reinforced the message. This was no ordinary place. It was an environment molded for absolute control. The private dining room revealed another level of power. Mahogany furniture, crystal chandeliers, Italian dishes meticulously arranged, expensive wines waiting to be served. Everything there existed to communicate wealth, stability, and dominance. Capone didn't need to raise his voice. The setting spoke for itself. When Al Capone stood to greet him, the gesture had an immediate impact. He extended his hand. In 1928, few white men shook hands with a black man in public, much less in private, much less in that context. It wasn't politeness, it was calculation. Capone was setting the tone. This conversation would be about business, not humiliation. "Welcome to Chicago," Capone said. "Sit down. Let's eat first. Business isn't done on an empty stomach." Bumpy sat down carefully, maintaining the perfect balance between respect and firmness. He couldn't appear submissive, nor arrogant. He didn't represent just himself. He represented all of Harlem. "Mr. Capone," Johnson began, his voice steady. "Madame St. Clair sends her regards. She believes that what I am going to present today can benefit us all." Capone listened in silence, pouring wine, observing every inflection of voice, every pause. His main men watched everything attentively, waiting for the slightest slip that would justify ending the meeting definitively. "I'll be direct," Capone replied. "When they told me Harlem wanted to negotiate with me, I thought it was a joke. Do you know what you're asking?" Bumpy didn't look away. "I'm asking you to choose profit over war, efficiency over blood." The silence that followed was heavy. At that moment, Bumpy Johnson was not just a messenger. He was a test, a living challenge to the racial structure of the American underworld. If he survived that moment, he would prove that Harlem was not the periphery. It was territory. Capone stared at the young man before him for long seconds. He assessed not only the proposal, but the man, the courage, the posture, clarity. Then, unexpectedly, Capone smiled. Not a friendly smile, a smile of someone who recognizes intelligence where he didn't expect to find it. "You've got courage, kid," he said. "Now tell me, what exactly does Harlem want in exchange for peace?" At that moment, the negotiations ceased to be impossible, and the real game began.
The silence that followed Al Capone's question wasn't empty. It was pure calculation. For the first time since sitting down at the table, Bumpy Johnson knew he had passed the point of immediate risk. Now, everything depended on logic, numbers, and foresight. Bumpy settled into his chair with deliberate calm. Every movement was conscious. He knew this wasn't just a negotiation for Harlem. It was a hearing before the man who dictated the pace of American organized crime. "We want to stop the war," Johnson began. "Not because we're afraid of it, but because it doesn't make financial sense." He then explained the obvious that few wanted to admit. The constant attacks by white gangsters on Harlem's gambling operations hadn't produced real control. Only deaths, excessive spending, and unwanted visibility. Money burned to maintain a war that wasn't progressing. Carefully, Johnson removed an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. Inside were numbers. Detailed reports on how much Dutch Schultz and other bosses were spending monthly trying to dominate Harlem. Bribes, gunmen, operational losses. After months of conflict, the return was practically zero. Capone didn't interrupt. He took the papers. He read them. He passed them on to his men. The atmosphere in the room changed. This wasn't a speech. It was a counting. "Now imagine another possibility," Bumpy continued. "Harlem generates about $20 million a year in bets, clean, after expenses, after bribes. What we're offering is simple." He paused briefly. Autonomy. Harlem would continue to be run by black operators. No interference, no invasions, no war. In exchange, a fixed percentage of the profits would be passed on to Capone's organization to guarantee protection and stability. 20%, said Johnson. $4 million a year. No shootings, no headlines, no calling the government on all of us. The room fell silent again. Capone leaned back in his chair, not out of audacity, but out of clarity. This wasn't submission. It was a business model, a model that recognized reality. Harlem couldn't be conquered without excessive cost. But Johnson wasn't finished. And we're not just talking about Harlem, he added. Other black communities in Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, they all face the same problem: constant war with little return. This agreement can be replicated. It was there that the proposal ceased to be local and became structural. Capone understood immediately. It wasn't just about immediate money, it was about the future. Prohibition wouldn't last forever. When alcohol became legal again, the empires based on alcohol would fall. The real future lay in gambling, betting, narcotics, and intelligent territorial control. And nobody operated numbers better than Harlem. Capone stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy Michigan Avenue. He was thinking aloud for the first time. "You think I didn't notice this?" he said without turning around. "Prohibition will end. Those who don't adapt die." He turned to Johnson. "I accept the deal, but not the way you presented it." The surprise was immediate. Capone lowered the percentage. 15%, not 20. Johnson blinked, confused. "But on one condition," Capone continued. "I want technical cooperation. I want your best operators to teach mine how you make the numbers game work so well. That's worth more than money." It wasn't just tribute. It was an exchange of knowledge. And then came the final proposal. "You stay in Chicago," Capone said, looking directly at Johnson. "You will be my link to Harlem and other black organizations. Learn how we operate here. Teach us how you operate over there. We'll organize it nationally." At that moment, Bumpy Johnson understood the magnitude of what was being offered. It wasn't a protection deal. It was the silent foundation of a new order. A racially segregated yet functional system, hierarchical yet stable,
an arrangement that could last for decades if it remained secret. And nobody needs to know, Capone concluded. Each side protects its own image. The public never finds out, the money flows, the violence decreases. Johnson remained silent for several seconds. This went far beyond the mandate he had been given. He needed to consult Stephanie St. Clair. He needed authorization to change history. "You have a week," Capone said. "After that, I'll let the war continue, and we'll see who can last longer." Bumpy nodded slowly. As he left that room, he carried more than just a proposal. It carried the invisible blueprint of a system that, if accepted, would shape American organized crime for nearly 40 years.
When Bumpy Johnson left the Lexington Hotel, he carried not only Al Capone's answer, he carried the responsibility of deciding whether Harlem would accept a pact that would guarantee stability at the cost of absolute silence. Hours later, in a discreet phone call, Johnson laid out every detail to Stephanie St. Clair. The proposal wasn't simple protection, it was an architecture of power. Territorial autonomy for black organizations, a fixed tribute for Italian families, technical cooperation in gambling, and an informal dispute resolution mechanism to avoid wars, all under one central principle: no one would speak publicly about the agreement. The answer came quickly. Harlem accepted. The invisible implementation. In the following days, Capone, his top men, and Johnson designed the practical workings of the pact. Black territories would be respected. In exchange, 15% of the gross profits from gambling would be paid regularly. The protection wouldn't be displayed, it would be felt. Fewer police raids, fewer rival incursions, less bloodshed. The most revolutionary element wasn't the money, it was the knowledge. Harlem operators taught collection, calculation, and payment systems that made the numbers game more efficient than any Italian operation up to that point. Cash flow improved, predictability increased, violence decreased. Johnson remained in Chicago as a national link, not as an exposed subordinate, but as a silent mediator. He connected cities, aligned expectations, and put out fires before they became headlines. The agreement grew. Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, the model repeated itself. Why the secrecy needed to exist? If it came to light, the pact would be attacked from all sides. Italian bosses would fear appearing weak for negotiating. Black communities would reject any suggestion of subordination. Politicians and the press would turn cooperation into a racial scandal. Silence was the cement that held everything together. And it worked. When prohibition began to crumble, organizations that depended solely on alcohol suffered. Those who had invested in gambling, structure, and coordination survived. The agreement model influenced the logic that would later organize Italian families nationally: clear borders, taxes, arbitration before violence. The consequences. Stability. Turf wars decreased dramatically in black neighborhoods. Capital. Gambling operations prospered and financed local businesses where banks refused credit. Power. Johnson returned to Harlem as one of the most influential men in the underworld, protected by agreements that few knew about. Persistence. Even after Capone's arrest, the pact was absorbed by new leadership and survived for decades. The silent end. Nothing ended with gunshots. The agreement slowly dissolved as new criminal economies, especially drugs, made the tax system obsolete, and as federal investigations dismantled national structures. What remained was the hidden history. An uncomfortable story. In a rigidly segregated America, criminals cooperated when it made financial sense, not for justice, for profit. Yet this cooperation shaped organized crime for generations. Conclusion. The 1928 meeting was not just a deal, it was a brutal lesson in pragmatism.
Capone didn't win by force. Johnson didn't win by submission. Both won because they understood that organization wins war.